give me a fill-in on all this Flash Gordon business. Matt grinned. Compared to what we're trying to do, Flash Gordon is a kid from the Stone Age. Okay, that was, of course, a general, let me go back. There is the indispensable man, Leslie R. Groves. He's not as well known as Patton or MacArthur or Eisenhower, but without him, the World War II would not have ended when it did. He was the son of a Presbyterian Army chaplain. He never swore or used bad language, but he rode people mercilessly, and he had absolutely no sense of humor. So the scientists who worked with him, yeah.
It might be this noise, but I couldn't hear his name.
General Leslie R. Groves, Groves. Leslie Groves. He is the person in charge of the Manhattan Project overall. And what is fascinating about this not easy to like person was he was incredibly able. He could get things done. And he rode roughshod over people. He got things done. But what fascinates me among the many things about Leslie Groves is that he was based in Washington, and every morning he would say goodbye to his wife, and he would go off to work. And his wife and his 2 adult children did not know what he was doing until Harry Truman announced Hiroshima. He did not know what their father was doing. Without him, the war would not have ended when it did. Now, this is the famous controlled nuclear reaction under the stands of the football field at the University of Chicago by Enrico Fermi. And this is the first atomic reactor. They called it a pile. And there's an artist's drawing of Enrico Fermi pulling out the rods for the first sustained nuclear reaction. There is a plaque at the University of Chicago. Now, the University of Chicago was originally part of the Big Ten in football, and so they played Ohio State and Michigan in Indiana. And then they got a new president who decided that football was not appropriate for a university, so he abolished the football program, but they still had this huge stadium that sat 20,000 people. So what do you do with it? And around the edge, there were a series of squash courts. So this first uranium pile was built on an unused squash court or in the unused football stadium at the University of Chicago. And when this story was translated into Russian, the Russians had a little difficulty with the phrase squash court. And so it was translated as the first controlled nuclear reaction was conducted in a pumpkin patch. And then, of course, this is J. Robert Oppenheimer, the enigmatic and fascinating director of Los Alamos, a most unusual choice. He had never been head of anything. He had not been head of his Department of Physics in California at either Caltech or the University of California, Berkeley. He was of notorious left-wing leanings. Whether he was or was not an actual member of the Communist Party is something of dispute. He is the tragic hero of the Manhattan Project. Everything revolves around him. He is the deepest thinker of the entire lot. And his story, there have been sort of 4 or 5 biographies within the last 8 years. John's is coming out in the fall. And the story just does not, the fascination with it does not end because he is such an incredible figure. He was so bright that he would finish people's sentences for them. He gave his first professional paper when he was 10 years old. He was in short pants, and it was on rocks. He went to the Ethical Culture School in New York, and he graduated in December of his senior year. And because his family was wealthy, they went over to Germany where he could work on some geological projects, and then he picked up a bug from Germany, and he brought it back, and he had terrible illness for over a year. Essentially, he couldn't be more than 50 yards away from a bathroom. And so he had to stay in his parents' apartment, and he became absolutely impossible. And the reason there is a link to New Mexico is that one of the people who went to the ethical culture school with him was Francis Ferguson of the famous Ferguson family of New Mexico. The father was the territorial representative, and then becomes the first state representative. And he convinced Oppenheimer that New Mexico was known for its healing powers. There's no proof of this, but I'm almost positive this is what happened. So Oppenheimer's father was absolutely at wit's end. He convinced a teacher from the ethical culture school to take the young Robert to New Mexico, which he did for an entire summer, and New Mexico cured him. New Mexico cured J. Robert Oppenheimer, and he fell in love with New Mexico. And that is one of the reasons why the Los Alamos laboratory is placed where it is. You will occasionally hear people say that Oppenheimer went to the famous Los Alamos Ranch School as a child, but that's not so. He first came to New Mexico to go on a camping trip in the Pecos Wilderness for about 2.5 months. It cured him. He went to Harvard. He finished Harvard in 3 years instead of 4. He could have been absolutely anything, and he decided he would enter this new field that was just breaking, subatomic physics. After he got his PhD at Göttingen, where he wrote his dissertation in 3 weeks, and in his dissertation defense, a later Nobel laureate, James Franck, said after the defense was over, he said, "I got out of there just in time. He was starting to ask me questions." So incredibly bright. He had 2 jobs, one at the University of California, Berkeley, 1 semester, and then he would go down to Caltech in Pasadena the next semester. And there was one Russian emigre woman who took the exact same class from him 4 different times, exact same class. And when she enrolled in the 5th time, they had to physically remove her from the class. Intelligence on that level is incredibly sexy. And she had fallen totally in love with it. Now, when Oppenheimer returned to the States after earning his PhD, the family purchased this cabin in the Pecos Wilderness, which is still owned by his son, Peter. And it's very primitive, dirt roads, no electricity, no running water. And this is the Oppenheimer cabin, which, while he was at Los Alamos, he would occasionally, with an FBI guard, spend the weekend at. And this is Lamy, New Mexico. The operating theory behind the Manhattan Project was that people should know only what they needed to know to do their own job. This is called compartmentalization. And compartmentalization meant that you didn't know what the person in the office next to you was working on, and you certainly had no idea what the person in the office upstairs was working on. And the scientists protested. They said, we can't do this. We cannot make this new weapon unless we can freely exchange information. General Groves was a fanatic about security.